Welcome to tonight's webinar, Navigating French Immersion. I'm Alicia Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of Dyslexia Canada. And I'm very excited for tonight's webinar. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I come at this as not only a person with dyslexia, but also the parent of a child with dyslexia and two children who completed French immersion, or one who's still in French immersion. So helping to navigate French immersion for students with dyslexia is something that is very tricky, but we are in good hands here tonight with Dr. Nancy Wise, who I have had the pleasure of speaking with in the past. And I'm very happy that she's here today to help answer your questions and go through some things with us. So before I jump into my part, Nancy, would you like to just say hello and introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I am an educational consultant and I specialize in French immersion. And I've been, I guess, for the last decade, meeting with families, many of whom have children who struggle with reading in the French immersion setting. And I try to help them get some supports in place for those kids. Prior to that, I was working on my doctorate, and during that 7 year period, I did some early intervention work with grade 1 French immersion students. It was a 3 year study, very exciting results. And before that, I was special education teacher in the French immersion setting. So that's my background.
Thank you. So for those of you who are new to Dyslexia Canada, we, as I said, are a national charity, and we're committed to ensuring that every child with dyslexia receives a fair and equitable education. And that includes being able to participate in the French immersion program. So on the systemic advocacy side of what we do at Dyslexia Canada, we were very involved with bringing forward the Right to Read public inquiry and bringing the issues and recommendations from the Right to Read inquiry forward to the government and advocating for that sort of change. For anybody who's listening who is not familiar with that, the Right to Read inquiry was a public inquiry run by the Ontario Human Rights Commission looking at systemic issues within education that create barriers to access to education, that make it more difficult for some groups of students to succeed with literacy and reading. So they were looking at students with dyslexia, but they were looking more broadly at best practices that can ensure that all children can be successful, both in the regular stream class as well as in programs like French immersion. Because if a child, a family wants to participate in French immersion, students have the right to do that with the support that they need so they can be successful. So one of the major recommendations coming out of the Right to Read inquiry was around universal screening. The province recommended that, the Human Rights Commission recommended that the province implement universal early screening from kindergarten to grade 2 for all students. And the province then went and chose 3 tools that all schools are going to be implementing. I should say for those joining us who are not from Ontario, other provinces are doing screening as well. Alberta has a screening mandate. New Brunswick has brought in some new assessments. They're not exactly screeners, but we'll get to talking about what those are in a moment too. But what for you, my question for you, Dr. Wise, is what does that look like in a French immersion setting? Are there tools that can be used for that same purpose of early identification to sort of identify kids that are at risk for experiencing reading difficulties within the French immersion program?
Yes, there are. So nice to be able to say that. I couldn't say that when we last spoke. There is a standardized French screening tool that can be used with French immersion students, and it's called Acadians Reading Français. A number of teachers have already received training in how to use it, and some teachers have actually been using it this year with their French immersion students. It's free to download, and it's a valid and reliable screening tool that indicates whether a child is at risk for later French reading difficulties. So for any parents or caregivers who are concerned about their child's French reading, be interesting to contact the school and find out whether any early screening has been done using this tool. Again, it's called Acadians Reading français. So for my doctoral research, my research team at OISE at the University of Toronto screened 252 grade 1 students who had just enrolled in the French Immersion program. And we identified 44 students who were at risk for later reading difficulties, which is roughly 17% of our participants. And in our study, we implemented early screening in English because the grade 1 students who participated in the study had just entered the French Immersion program. And that would be my recommendation for any school board or district that's intending to screen students who are brand new to the program. Students who have had no prior exposure to the French language. Screening in English will give teachers some indication of what they're bringing to the table. And it would be, of course, inappropriate to use a French screening tool with kids who are brand new to French, and we don't want to wait for them to develop those French language skills. We want to find out right away who's at risk, and we can do that in English. So when the year goes on for these students that are brand new to the program, screening could be done, say, in January or February of their first year in French immersion, just to see, how they're doing, who is at risk, after they've had a few months to gain, French reading, writing, speaking, listening skills. And I think it would be really interesting to compare the results of French and English screeners, because if the results suggest that a child is at risk for later reading difficulties in both languages, that could be an indication of a reading disability. It's not a diagnosis, it's just a red flag. A child who's acquiring an additional language but only has a reading problem in one of those languages, for example, in French, but not in English, that child probably doesn't have dyslexia, because a reading disability like dyslexia is going to impact their ability to learn to read in both languages. So if the child is only struggling in French, but not in English, that child just needs an additional dose of structured literacy instruction, maybe in a small group at another time of the day. For many years in French immersion, we've had a wait and see approach, and parents whose children were struggling were often encouraged to be patient and just give their kids a little bit more time to develop their French reading skills. And as a result of that, many children who were at risk for later reading problems missed out on early identification and early intervention opportunities. And I'm very pleased to see that boards and districts are beginning to make commitments to early screening in the French immersion setting, and at-risk readers are starting to be identified in a much more timely manner. Alicia, maybe you can describe for parents what happens in the regular English program if universal early screening indicates that a child is at risk for later reading difficulties.
Sure, absolutely. So, just like you said, that screening is not a diagnosis of a learning disability or dyslexia. It's just a red flag or like a temperature check, right? It indicates that there is something that we need to be concerned about or something is not within the normal range. And then the next step is for the teacher to do some additional assessments to try and determine what it is that is, concerning, or what it is that we need to be looking out for. And I can share actually, let me just share, if maybe MJ, if you don't mind putting the links in the chat through OnLit, which is a project that Dyslexia Canada has put together with the International Dyslexia Association, Ontario branch, with support from the Ministry of Education, we have created this diagnostic decision tree. So the next step after screening is really diagnostic assessment, and these are more informal, smaller tests that teachers can do that will help to inform them which skills the child needs additional support with so that they can understand where to start their instruction. So the link that MJ's put into the chat is a nice flow chart that really shows which sorts of assessments to look at after screening. So we know in English there are lots of different assessments, that diagnostic assessments that teachers have access to and are using. And I understand that there are some good ones in French immersion as well. Maybe you can speak to those.
Yeah, there are. The exciting news I wanted to share with families tonight is that a French immersion diagnostic assessment tool has been developed and it's ready for use with French immersion students. It's called Éclair. It assesses phonological awareness, phonics, and word reading. And this diagnostic assessment tool is currently being reviewed by the Ministry of Education in Ontario. And once it's approved, teachers across the country will be able to use it with students. They have screened students who have these results that suggest that they are at risk for later reading difficulties. Now, just a note for families, if your child is entering French immersion this coming September and the school decides to do some screening in English, as I would hope they would if they're new to the program, and the results indicate that your child is at risk for later reading problems, I would suggest that the diagnostic assessment be done in English as well. We don't want to wait in between the screening and the diagnostic assessment. We want to find out right away where those gaps are and how to remediate. So in January or February of a child's first year in the program, it would be probably a good idea to administer the diagnostic assessment in French and then compare the results with the results that were obtained in English. Any parents or caregivers who have any questions about universal early screening or diagnostic assessments can ask questions by first registering for Dyslexia Compass online, and a volunteer supporter will respond within a few days. So maybe, Alicia, we should talk about getting a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, because that's often the next step. Children don't have to be diagnosed in order to use Dyslexia Compass, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely not. Dyslexia Compass is open to anybody at any point in the journey. So if you're a parent, even if you're just concerned about your child's reading in French immersion and you're looking to ask some questions about, interpreting that screening data or what to ask for in diagnostic assessment, you're welcome to visit us. And actually, maybe MJ, oh, great, MJ just put the link to that in the chat. Thank you, MJ, you're on it. And our volunteers are happy to support with that sort of thing. We're always happy to support. So I don't think that having a formal assessment should ever be a barrier to accessing any sort of service. I'm sure you'd agree, Nancy.
Yeah, I do. Getting a formal diagnosis by a psychologist can be very useful, but the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read inquiry report clearly stated that schools shouldn't wait for the results of a psychological assessment before implementing reading interventions, evidence-based reading interventions. That's so important because getting a diagnosis can take time. So parents can waitlist their child for a psychological assessment at school. Those tend to be lengthy waits. Or if they're in a financial position to consider doing it privately, they can arrange for a private psychological assessment. Some of the parents I've consulted with thought they'd have to find a psychologist who could do the assessment in French because their child is in French immersion, but that's usually not the case. To my knowledge, there aren't any standardized tests of cognitive ability that are normed on the French immersion population. There certainly are standardized tests normed on French as a first language student population, but they're just not appropriate for use with French immersion students. And our French immersion students tend to perform in the low average to below average range on these tests. In Canada, most psychological assessments are conducted in English, and they include tests of cognitive abilities, reasoning skills, memory, processing speed, attention, and executive functioning, among other things. And they might also include tests of reading, writing, and math, which could be challenging for a French immersion child who hasn't yet had any English language instruction at school, but they can still be informative. If your child did have a diagnostic assessment in French, the results of that assessment, it would be a good idea to share those results with the psychologist who's assessing your child. I should mention, this is important, that a formal diagnosis by a registered psychologist might help your child to get a better grasp of the challenges they're facing at school. You know, they look around and they see that their friends, many of them, are reading better than they are. And that can be stressful and anxiety provoking. And, you know, it may also reduce some of the self-blame that often accompanies reading disabilities. This idea, you know, what's wrong with me? Why can't I read like my friends? And not being able to read can really take a toll on a young person's mental health. Don't you
That's,
think?
yeah, that's so true. That the self-awareness piece that comes from those assessments is great. I see there's a lot of active chat going on right now, really around the barriers to access to receiving an assessment and how school boards will sometimes say that you need to have an assessment to get services, this sort of thing. Or, you know, sometimes I've heard people say as well that when a child is in French immersion, the school will say, well, we can't do any assessments until the child's been in the program for, a longer period of time or until English instruction has started. That was the case in my own son's school where it was full French immersion until grade 3, and then English started in grade 3. And they said, well, we can't do anything until after they've had a year of that English instruction, which can really, push the time frame for an assessment back really until grade 3 or grade 4, which is quite late.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a requirement that some school boards and districts have. But the Ontario Right to Read Inquiry Report suggests, I want to just quote this, make sure I get it right, that a student with severe word reading difficulties who's not responding to appropriate interventions can be diagnosed in late grade 1 or grade 2. If the student has not responded adequately to intensive evidence-based interventions, it is not necessary or appropriate to wait until grade 3 to refer them for psychological assessment, although this is a common belief and practice. You know, for a student in French immersion who's struggling in reading and is being provided with evidence-based interventions, but is not responding as expected, a psychological assessment really should be done earlier rather than later. And I just wanted to point out that the assessment report that's completed by the psychologist can be very useful when it comes to developing your French immersion child's individual education plan, or IEP. And that's because the report contains specific recommendations for the classroom. Dyslexia Compass is there for any parents or caregivers who have questions about getting a formal diagnosis. All you got to do is fill out that online registration form. We should probably talk more about IEPs. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. There's some questions in the chat about IEPs and advocating for getting IEPs. And
Yeah.
someone in there said that you were actually very helpful in securing an IEP for their child. So that's really lovely to see that in the
That's
chat.
nice to hear.
Yeah, so maybe you can expand upon that for the other parents who you haven't already supported in getting IEPs.
Yes. So for French immersion children with dyslexia, the IEP can really be very beneficial. An IEP is the school's action plan for your child, your dyslexic child. Depending on the province you live in, it may be called something other than an IEP. I think some provinces call it an IPP, individual program plan, I think. But an IEP is developed for French immersion students in much the same way that IEPs are developed for students in the regular English program. There are IEP accommodations and there are IEP modifications. Modifications are changes to the curriculum expectations. Accommodations tend to fall in three categories. So there's instructional accommodations, and those could be something like providing your child with additional time to complete tasks, or breaking lengthy assignments down into smaller chunks. There's another category called environmental accommodations, and that could be something like preferential seating in the classroom to minimize distractions. And lastly, there are assessment accommodations, and those could be things like oral testing rather than written tests all the time. It could involve scribe support or extended time limits on tests. Now, I have a very important message for families who are watching this presentation. If you have a child who continues to struggle following the implementation of their IEP, that does not mean you need to immediately consider a switch to the regular English program. Many of the families that I've consulted with have made that assumption. What it means if your child is still struggling, say a couple months after the IEP was implemented, is that a review of the IEP is necessary. An IEP is a working document, and it needs to change as your child's needs change. So it would be best to schedule a meeting with your school team and just sit down and review it, see what's working and what needs to change. We probably should talk more about modifications, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. Before we do that, though, I mean, I just want to say that point about, that idea that if the child is still struggling, we should move them into the English stream. Like that's such an important point. And I know we hear that all the time, even before the IEP is developed, sometimes as soon as there's any indication that there is a struggle, sometimes the first advice can be, well, let's just put the kid in English, and there's so many things that can be tried and put in place before that happens. So I'm really glad you said that. But yeah, let's dig into the difference between those IEP accommodations and modifications, because that's a really important piece that I know that the first time that I got an IEP for my son, I didn't really understand the difference between those two. And so I think it's really important that we clarify that for people.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So it's always a good idea, that's what I say to families when we meet, to begin with IEP accommodations, just to see how your child does, even if your school team is urging you to consider modifications. Modifications often involve changes to grade level expectations. So for example, if your child is struggling in reading, they may be using reading materials at a lower grade level. But if you feel confident that your child can comprehend grade level materials and you think they have average cognitive abilities, IEP accommodations should be all that's necessary to help them access grade level content in the classroom. Modifications might make school easier in the short term because your child is using materials at a lower grade level, but in the long run, modifications can make it very difficult for your child to catch up to their peers who are working at grade level. And this can really limit their options going forward, particularly in high school. Maybe, Alicia, can you talk a little bit about assistive technology, which is one of the most important accommodations for students with dyslexia?
Yes, it is. Assistive tech has a huge role to play. And I just want to underscore that piece about modifications that you were saying. Like so often, it's unfortunate, but when we see IEPs come through with modifications listed, there's no plan in place to actually catch the kid up, right? It's just a permanently lowering of expectations, right? And that is not what we want for kids at all. So when modifications are put in place, I think the important thing as well, because sometimes they are necessary for a period of time, but there really needs to be a solid intervention plan that is happening with those modifications. So my advice to parents there would be to really ask, what are you doing to get the child off of the modifications before you accept those on your IEP? But when it comes to the assistive tech piece, yes, absolutely. Assistive tech is helpful for dyslexic students in English, and it's also very helpful in French. I know we used quite a bit of that with my son during the period that he was sort of catching up. His English reading came together more quickly than his French reading. He was a few years behind. So he was using the assistive tech more in French for a period of time, but he's doing well in both languages now. Um,
Good.
one one tool that we really found useful, and I'm not plugging Microsoft, they do not donate to Dyslexia Canada or anything like that, but I just truly found it very useful, was the Immersive Reader suite of tools. And I loved that because it was available in both French and English. You can put French text in there and it will translate words that you don't know as well. But in addition to reading the text out loud, doing that text to speech piece, you can do it in assistive mode where it's only going to read the words that the child is struggling with too. So there's, full listening mode or there's just assisted reading mode, which I found was really very helpful. But there's certainly a big variety of technology that's available. And those can be implemented in French immersion for sure, along with other types of accommodations. I'm sure you've got more suggestions. I only have my own personal and anecdotal experience there, so maybe you can expand upon that a little.
Sure. So in the French immersion setting, students need to be able to access grade level content in French and English. Now, if your child has had a psychological assessment and the assessment report recommends that a computer and specialized software are essential for them to be able to access the curriculum, then a SIA claim can be submitted by a special education teacher on your child's behalf to get them their own assistive tech, which is often a Chromebook loaded with all kinds of software that they're going to need at no cost to your family. And at least that's how it works here in Ontario. A SIA claim can be initiated to support a child's learning needs, even if they haven't been formally identified by an IPRC, Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. But in order to be eligible for a SIA claim, a student must have an IEP. And then once that SIA claim is submitted and approved, a child will receive their Chromebook, and at that point, they're provided with a series of training sessions to show them how to use the software. And at those sessions, they'll also learn how to switch from one language to another, from French to English and back again, to help them understand classroom materials that they're required to read, and then learn how to demonstrate their knowledge in writing. In my experience, I have to say I've seen that regular use of assistive technology has been a real game changer for some French immersion students with dyslexia. And some Ontario school boards have a guide to SIA claims that can be downloaded. This one it was put out by the York Region District School Board, a family guide to special equipment amount, which is SIA claims, and it goes into what a SIA claim is and all about that process. So if you're in a province other than Ontario, this process may work a little bit differently. Alicia, would you mind talking a little bit about the role of parents in the IEP process?
Yes, absolutely. Before I do that, just sort of jumping into the SIA claims in other provinces, it does work very differently in other provinces. I've talked to parents in several provinces that don't really have an equivalent program at all, and it can be really difficult to get tech through school.
Okay.
Just to know that there is a program, I think it's through the federal government. If you reach out to through Dyslexia Compass, that can get discounted used equipment essentially for students with disabilities, that sort of thing. And that information you could get by emailing us at Dyslexia Canada as well. There's some forms that we can provide you, and then you can access that program too. The other piece about that for people who are in Ontario is the training piece that you mentioned. In that, yes, the students are supposed to be provided with training on the SIA equipment, and that is something that often parents really need to advocate for and ask, like, is the training happening? When is the training happening? And especially for students with a learning disability or dyslexia, it can't be a one and done training. They're not going to absorb everything that they need to know about using that Chromebook in, a half an hour session, right? So I know there are some school boards that have training programs where there's multiple sessions where they have, follow-ups and that sort of thing. So just being aware of that, I think is important for parents if you are getting a Chromebook for your child, making sure that they do have the training so that they know how to actually use all of those fancy features that are built in, because they're there, but sometimes they're not super intuitive. Yeah, but on to the IEPs. So yeah, IEPs, and they're called IPPs, ILPs, different provinces, depending on where you are, different things. But universally, from what I've learned, is that they should be developed with parental involvement for sure. How that works really depends on your school or your district. In Ontario, we've got the difference between the IEP and then we've got IPRCs, the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee meetings. Those are a little bit more formal. They're quite a bit more formal, and they um, establish that legal aspect of your child having a formal identification of having dyslexia or learning disability. But more often than not, people have an IEP without actually having an IPRC, those informal IEPs. And often school staff actually suggest that you just get the informal IEP and not worry about getting the IPRC, all that formal stuff, ahead of time to formally identify your child. So many school boards do have a guide to the IPRC process that you can download. But those are different processes. The IEP and the IPRC process are different. So Nancy, maybe you can expand on that piece a little bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to first show, this is something parents can download just as an example. This is a guide to the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee put out by the Toronto District School Board, and it goes through that whole process. Yeah, the Dyslexia Compass would be pleased to answer any question about any of the things we've discussed so far, whether it's the IPRC process or IEPs, accommodations and modifications, or even CF claims for students in the French immersion setting.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I find, many school boards really are pushing the informal IEPs and really just trying to accommodate students instead of really offering them the evidence-based reading interventions that they need. And, accommodations are really important. The technology piece is really, really important, but it's not a replacement for reading intervention, right? And that was something that was really, really highlighted in the Right to Read inquiry report, that students, in addition to having having those accommodations, really need to have interventions provided. But it's an additional challenge when kids are in the French immersion setting. So, what kind of reading interventions, can we expect, or should schools be providing to students in the French immersion environment? And should they be in French or should they be in English? Because this is something that we get a lot of questions about. What should we do there?
Yeah. For French immersion students to benefit academically, reading intervention should be provided in whichever language is the primary language of instruction in the classroom. So if they're getting, say, 80 to 100% of their instruction in French, then reading intervention should be offered in French. And if your child is in a partial immersion program where they spend half their day learning in French and the other half learning in English, then reading interventions may have to be provided in both languages. If that was necessary, then I think instruction needs to focus, at least initially, on those aspects of French and English that are the same or similar. For example, many consonants and some vowels are the same in the two languages. And then later on, when teaching aspects of the language that are different, teachers have to be careful to explain to the students how they are different. And these differences should be explicitly taught. For example, teachers should explain that the sound sh is represented by the letters sh in English, but it's represented by the letter ch in French. Now, one important note is that there's no reason to wait for children to demonstrate competence in listening and speaking in French before providing reading interventions. If your child is identified through early screening as being at risk for later reading problems, and a diagnostic assessment has been completed showing where the gaps are in their learning and where to begin instruction, reading interventions should be provided as soon as possible. And research has shown that there should be just as much emphasis on spelling instruction as there is on reading instruction, because children with dyslexia often struggle in both. And I know, Alicia, you have heard this research too. They say if you can read a word, if you can spell a word, you can almost always read that word. But it doesn't work so well the other way. If you can read a word, you cannot necessarily spell it correctly. So instruction for children with dyslexia has to focus on both reading and spelling. But teachers who are working with struggling students in French immersion have to always keep in mind that these students are acquiring an additional language. So teachers who are providing those reading interventions have to ensure that the children are understanding what they're reading, understanding the words, the phrases, the sentences, the paragraphs, making sure that the second language isn't tripping them up. And it's so important. And in the classroom, setting, there has to be a heavy emphasis on the development of oral language and vocabulary and background knowledge, so that when they do see these words in print, they'll know what they mean. And I just wanted to mention that getting your French immersion child diagnosed by a registered psychologist may not get your child the support they need at school if the school does not offer reading interventions for children in the French immersion program. And I know I've heard about these, and I'm sure you have too, Alicia. But in those cases, parents would have to look for those supports outside of the school setting. But I am pleased to say that schools are increasingly providing at-risk readers with French immersion, structured literacy instruction, and evidence-based interventions. So things are definitely looking brighter than they did when we last spoke. During my consultations with families, I'm often asked, what if reading interventions are available in English but not in French? Well, research has shown that learning to read one language supports learning to read in another language. So students who come to school with some ability to read in their home language typically learn to read in the second language relatively easily. And students who learn to read in a second language tend to acquire skills that help them learn to read in their home language. In my doctoral research at OISE at the University of Toronto, the 44 students we identified as being at risk for later reading difficulties received an intervention in English at the same time that they were getting reading instruction in their classrooms in French. And interestingly, the students in the treatment group in our study outperformed the students in the control group. The treatment group made significant reading gains in French, even though the intervention that we provided was in English. So we know that skills do transfer from one language to another. Perhaps, Alicia, you could talk a little bit about the support you offered your son when he was struggling to learn to read in the French immersion context.
Yes, well, I think my own experience echoes what you found in your doctoral research. So, and I will say as well, there's a lot of points in the chat here about, schools really are trying to provide more structured literacy support and to support kids in French immersion, but there is a shortage of teachers nationally. There's also a shortage of teachers that really have that knowledge and skills in structured literacy because of the, all of the issues that were identified in the Right to Read report are national issues around, the preparation of teachers. So, when we say these things aren't available in school, really, we're not, blaming educators here in any way. There are some major structural issues that are at play. That means that it is difficult to get the support you need for your child,
Yeah.
sometimes within English, but also within French immersion. But yes, my experience of helping my own son. So I do not speak French myself. I'm also dyslexic. So I'm, not really equipped to teach him to read in English either. But I was more equipped to do that than in French. So we did a combination of things for sure. So eventually we were able to get him into an intervention program at school. So he did participate in SRA corrective reading in school for a period of time. And then we did a lot of work with him at home using some of the intervention ideas from the webinar series, Helping Your Struggling Reader, which was available on the IDA Ontario, or is available on the IDA Ontario website. But all of that work that we did with him at home and that the support he was getting at school was all entirely in English. There was no available support within the French immersion program. But it was really important to him that he stay in French immersion. He actually loved speaking in French. Like, he didn't have any problems picking up oral language in French. It was reading and writing in both languages that were a challenge. And we found that as he was getting that intervention with his reading and writing and spelling in English, he did start to improve. Like, it took several years because he's he's quite dyslexic. But that intervention really heavily focused on spelling as well. That was the missing piece that we found, was that once we really started to focus on a systematic approach to teaching him to practice to spell and practicing spelling, that helped the reading come along much, much more quickly than even our earlier attempts at supporting him through in the English program. And once his English started to come along, his French started to come along as well. So I found that he was maybe a year and a half, 2 years sort of behind in French from where he was in English. But by the time he was in grade 8, he was able to read and write in both languages pretty well. So yes, I would say our little anecdotal story over here very much mirrors what you found in your doctoral research. But that sort of brings up a point, though. If your child is receiving intervention, whether it's at school or whether it's outside of school, whatever you're doing, really like monitoring that intervention to make sure that it is effective and it is actually moving the child forward is really, really important. And this is the big piece that we've been talking to a lot of families about now, whether they're getting support for their child at school, if there is intervention available, whether it's in French, whether it's in English, whether they're getting private tutoring, whatever it is, really talking about progress monitoring. So what are we putting in place so that we can make sure that the intervention and support that's being provided to the child is actually moving the child forward, right? So that's something that certainly was discussed in the Right to Read report, the importance of using objective progress monitoring data to make sure that, the things that we have taught the child that they're learning, right? And that's a piece that I've found that even in the English intervention programs, often they're just saying, we provided 52 lessons of intervention, but they're not actually using a progress monitoring tool. So do you have any thoughts about progress monitoring and what that should look like that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, just because we've taught it doesn't mean they've learned it, right? That's what it's all about. Teachers can often feel, wonderful about all the work they've done during instruction, but has the child grasped what's been taught is the key issue. And, there are some great progress monitoring materials in both French and English that teachers can use now. So that then if it looks like they're on the wrong track with a particular child, they can change their instruction a little, tweak it so that their progress is better going forward.
Excellent. I am going to read the questions from the chat and ask you a whole bunch of questions, but while I'm doing that, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we get to those questions?
I do. So before we wrap up, I just want to say, I mean, I'm very passionate in my advocacy for French immersion, but children with dyslexia can definitely benefit from participation in French immersion and enjoy the many advantages of becoming functionally bilingual. That said, they are likely going to need evidence-based interventions and IEP accommodations, including access to assistive technology. But students with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia should not be systematically counseled out of French immersion programs. There is simply no research evidence that has indicated that children with dyslexia should be excluded from second or additional language learning opportunities. We've talked tonight about some of the steps that can be taken if your child is at risk for or diagnosed with dyslexia. And we wanted to be sure to share Dyslexia Compass with families so that they know that they can reach out if they have a French immersion child and they have questions about screening or diagnostic assessments formal diagnoses, IPRCs, IEPs, SIA claims, reading interventions, or progress monitoring, any of it, you can simply fill in the online registration form and pose your question and someone will get back to you. And if families want to connect with me, you can find all my contact information on my website. All you got to do is Google Nancy Wise French Immersion and it'll come up. I'm also on X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So you can contact me in any of those ways.
Excellent, thank you. So I did have a chance to glance through the questions. So we had a lot of people, or several questions, going back to the screening tool you mentioned, Acadiens Français. So one of the questions is really about accessing that. So asking, where do you get that? And someone else asked, has it changed from EDIPAL? If you could sort of speak to as much of that.
Yes, it was called EDIPAL. The name has changed. If you Google Acadiens Reading Français, you'll find all kinds of information and ways to download it. There is a course you can take with several modules to learn how to use it, and many teachers have taken that course, or some boards have sent a few teachers to take the course, and then those teachers share their knowledge with the rest of the French immersion teachers in their school. So the information is there, the screening tool is there. Again, it's a valid and reliable, standardized screening tool, and people are pretty excited about it.
Yes, I'd say I'm pretty excited about it. There was a question in the chat about, are we endorsing any screening tools? So I'm going to answer that for Dyslexia Canada, and then I'll kick it over to Nancy to answer for Nancy. So Dyslexia Canada, we're not endorsing a specific screening tool, but I can tell you the ones that have been chosen and selected and vetted by provinces. So Acadiens Français was vetted by the province of Ontario and was selected as the French language screening tool. There were 3 English screening tools that were chosen in Ontario. There's the English version of Acadiens, just called Acadiens, and then also another one called Easy CBM and AIMSweb Plus. I believe Acadiens is, the English Acadiens I know is on the Alberta list. Alberta has a few other screening tools they use as well. The TOSRAC and the TOWRI, I think are the ones that they're using. They also had Dibbles on their list. I'm not sure if they have Acadiens Français on their list. If anybody is here from Alberta, you can just have the answer to that, please pop it in the chat. But at Dyslexia Canada, we don't endorse specific tools. What we do is we discuss what makes a good screening tool. So, it needs to be valid, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be something that's been researched over an extended period of time. And Acadiens Français certainly meets those requirements, as do the 3 English tools that were chosen by the province of Ontario. But I'll flip that over to you, Nancy. And if I'm not sure if you recommend screening tools specifically, or just point to other sources.
I'm just aware that Ontario has recommended Acadiens Reading Français. It's the only screening tool in French that is being recommended in this province. So I don't have anything further to add other than I strongly hope that there will be some professional development in the use of this screening tool before September.
I hope so too. And somebody did pop in the chat, and it's right, it's jogging my memory now. Alberta uses the CC3 and the lens assessment, which I believe they had adapted to French. Like, I believe there are French versions of those in Alberta. If the person who put that in the chat knows that, please please answer that. But now that I'm thinking about it, I think the province of Alberta worked with the University of Ottawa with some researchers there, and they did adapt something into French that they're using. That's correct. Thank you. Okay, good. That's lovely. And also, like, following up on the screening question before we get to the next, people were asking about, well, what do you do for progress monitoring? What sort of progress monitoring tools? Are those commercial tools? Are those informal tools? What are the progress monitoring tools we're talking about?
So progress monitoring tools are also standardized. Acadiens, pretty sure in English and French, offers quite a number of different forms that can be used for screening at various times during the year. It only takes 5 to 7 minutes to work with a child in K through grade 2 to get through the screening or the progress monitoring. It's really very quick and provides a lot of information and good data.
Yeah, that data from progress monitoring, I think, is so important. So at this point now, whenever somebody is coming and talking to us through Dyslexia Compass about the intervention their child is receiving, that's the number one thing that we're recommending is talk to the school about progress monitoring, ask for them to implement progress monitoring and share that with you. If you're in a school that has screening, like then they have the tools available already to do the progress monitoring. But sometimes, the screening is new for a lot of schools and it's a work in progress, right? So sometimes it takes that parent that can come in and ask in a constructive way and kind of explain why you want this data and ask for the data to be sent home. So that's really important. And keeping that data, because that data can be really important to provide to the psychologist. If your child is not responding to the intervention, having that information, wouldn't you agree, Nancy, that would be an important thing to have available?
100%, yes.
Yeah. The several questions here in the chat too about really comorbid diagnoses such as ADHD and developmental language disorder. So supporting students with comorbid diagnoses in French immersion. Can you speak to that?
Well, for me, it's all about developing a close collaboration with your school team. You have a team of people who bring a lot of expertise with them on the various diagnoses, and as a team you can decide how to best meet the needs of the child and the various things that they need support with. So as you've said several times, it's a work in progress. You're going to have to just find a good place to start and build in supports over time, always making sure to review what is happening and is it working or is it not working and what do we need to change.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of comments in the chat about the importance of that early identification and early intervention. So I wonder if you wanted to expand on that, why it's so important to get in there early.
So many students leave French immersion in those sort of end grade 3, beginning grade 4 time period. And it's often because they had undiagnosed or not diagnosed reading difficulties that weren't screened early on. Early identification sets them up for success. If their teachers know in kindergarten that they are at risk for later reading difficulties, then they can put supports in place when they're young, and there's a much smaller achievement gap when they're in kindergarten in grade 1 compared to when they're in grade 3. So the interventions won't need to be provided for as long. The content that they're learning in class and isn't as complex when they're young. So it's always best to identify early, use the screening data and the diagnostic assessment data to show you where the gaps are that need to be filled.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there were some questions as well just about what does that intervention look like, right? And I think this is something important that we could kind of expand upon here a bit, because the previous model, like pre-right to read, last time I talked to you, like in 2019, sort of the way it worked was, we'd push kids along, we'd wait for them to fail, they'd get to grade 3, we'd give them a psychoeducational assessment, and then intervention might start, and it would be something like, if it was in English, it'd be something like Empower or something like that that lasts for an entire year, maybe, maybe 2. now that we're looking at screening and we're looking at early interventions and we're looking more at a tiered model and we're looking at shorter things, can you kind of expand on what that might look like in the classroom and how that's different than the older referral model?
In the old model, we can't it's not sustainable. We can't possibly address all those needs, all those children who got no support up to, you know, grade 3. So the idea is to put evidence-based structured literacy instruction in tier 1 to reduce the number of students that will need the more intensive levels, the more intensive tiers down the line. Because if we have, say, more than 20% of our students needing reading remediation, it's not sustainable for any school board or district. So by providing them with the kinds of instruction that scientific studies have shown us is effective for children in learning to read, we greatly reduce those numbers.
Exactly. And that can be done in French and it can be done in English, right? That same systematic,
Yes.
explicit approach to breaking it down. Yes. So I think we are at our time. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And again, if you have questions, please email us the Dyslexia Compass program. You can fill out the form, which MJ put in the chat, which you can find on our website, or you can email us at info@dyslexiacanada.org. And Nancy provided her contact information, and I'm sure she would love to hear from you as well. So thank you again, Dr. Wise, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. We should not wait 3 more years or 4 more years to do this again. The last time we did this was it 2019? It was, or no,
2021,
20,
not that long.
oh, 3 years. Okay, great. We should do this more often. I think this is
Yes, we should.
helpful. And I'm thank you everyone for joining us. And there was a question about a recording. Yes, we did record it. So you can reach out to us so we can provide that link as well.
Thanks for this opportunity, Alicia.
Thanks. Good night.
Night.